A sure method. I spent $1 last week, said the good thing, in answer to that advertisement offering a method of saving one half my gas bills. And you got? A printed slip directing me to paste them in a scrapbook. Hey there. Welcome to History Chats. Yeah. This is, I think, the first iteration of this little quip, which I believe first appeared here in the Cincinnati Enquirer on March 11th, 1897. Over the next decade or so, and occasionally a little after that, these words would be reprinted and recycled in newspapers across the world as a sort of humorous space filler. Over the course of the rest of 1897, for example, these words would be largely republished verbatim in other newspapers all over the world, in hundreds of them, probably. I don't have a clear understanding of the numbers, but yeah. And they often do credit these lines as coming from the Cincinnati Enquirer, but not always. Depended if they had a room. It's also worth noting some of them do also in 1897 credit this joke as coming from the American Druggist, which is another publication that may have been the origin. It's really not that important. I don't have access to that double check, but really it isn't really that important because even for people who do have it credited, like if you're in Cleveland, Ohio, and you get your copy of the Plains Dealer that day, the bit is what it is, right? Little quip. It doesn't matter if it's properly attributed in terms of the readers, and in practice, they didn't really do it anyway. But this joke doesn't just stay in 1897 again. As I said, it continues to evolve. New versions of the joke, reworded and reworked and recycled, will continue to make the rounds in the papers every few years, but always with that same structure and with the same punchline. In fact, in 1903, the Wausau Pilot here publishes that newspaper. This is a version that was going around at the time, and it's credited to the Philadelphia Public Ledger, although they don't include it here for lack of space. 5 years later, in 1908, the Daily Herald, Wausau Daily Herald, also publishes it. Another version, and it's been reworked, but here they do credit it to the Chicago News. This was pretty common back in those days, right? To it was completely acceptable and even expected of newspaper editors for them to have their own collections of little scraps of writing that they could integrate into their publications when the need might be. These might be evergreen bits of sage advice or Bible verses, little tidbits of trivia, jokey lines displaying some humor and wit, all gleaned from other newspapers and magazines. Again, if we look here, well, there's the commonality in that. From the Wausau Daily Herald in 1908, this is the spread here of the newspaper. There is the joke. It appeared on page 4. And if we actually look, all of these are essentially these things. These are little bits of information. Like, so we can kind of zoom in. We have how to tell a boiled egg instructions right next to a description of Egypt's wonderful progress in the last 20 years. And none of these are credited as coming from another source, but I think people would have understood that, for example, nobody in Wausau is going to Edinburgh, Scotland, to interview Dr. Cloeton, to find out what the symptoms of having the medical after effects of having the grip. No, this is taken off some other source and included. Let's just zoom out. Great. This provided an exchange, though. This, as I said, it was pretty common at this point. And the reason that this worked is because it allowed for newspapers to exchange, these things, which would help to fill the space in the columns. You can see that these are all kind of crammed in here at the end of the pages or in between other advertisements and stories, just to kind of make things consistent. And essentially, this was a practice because it allowed for people to fill the space when they didn't have necessarily enough to fill everything with news or advertising. It also made it possible for you to do this without having to dedicate a lot of staff time to write all of these things. You just borrowed from other people. And of course, they're not grabbing bad stuff, they're grabbing the good stuff. And so the quality of the writing was seen as being improved, the enjoyment of the readers of the newspaper by having these little bits and pieces. Here's a question. Is it a joke? I guess we could call it a joke, and I probably should for clarity, but it also just kind of feels a little strong for what it was. Granted, humor tends not to, it's subjective at the best of times, and when you add over a century of time, it's hard to know exactly if it lands the same as it would have back then. But I also don't think it was meant to be that funny in the first place. These sort of editions are meant to be read as sort of this written equivalent of small talk, right? Something light and mildly entertaining that you might use to fill the space between other things, or in this case, to even out the columns on the page without making it feel like you were wasting the time of the readers. Again, if we go back to the Wausau Daily Herald and this example, we can see all sorts of little bits and pieces that are thrown in, and none of these are that like, okay, college men might be expected to be devoted at present to preparations for examinations, but they do not appear to be too much engrossed in the matter. It's like, okay, college people are taking exams. You see, I mean, it's not like there's a whole lot of substance here, but it's small talk essentially. Also, in fairness, I think if you hold up a magnifying glass and examine a joke of any sort, it tends not to make it any funnier. So I guess we'll set that question aside. But we are kind of examining it, so let's examine it. Let me go back to, there we go. So what is the joke here? If you didn't catch it, it's this. It's all fake, by the way. This is not an actual thing. This is all for the sake of the joke. You have a gentleman who responds to an advertisement in the paper, sends $1 with the understanding that it will be given back to them as a surefire way to save money, in this case on gas bills. But unfortunately, he misread the ad. Instead of saving on gas bills, it was save gas bills. And so, hey, if you put it in a scrapbook, you won't lose it. And that's the joke, right? And it's fine. It gets the job done. It's not new. I mean, we can look at like examples like this one here. This is an earlier version of it. This is from a British paper in the late 1800s. I think this is 1890. Yeah, right here. And you can see here, so here's another sort of format. A certain thin man sent $1 in postage stamps to an advertiser who promised for that sum to impart trustworthy information how to get fat, and received the message on a postcard, buy it at the butcher's. Again, that's kind of fun. For this to land, you gotta understand that like fat has, the two meanings. You would use fat as a thing for cooking and for fuel, and you get it at the butcher. Look, you get the idea. You can understand it from context, and I think this works pretty well. And in fact, some ways works better than the other example because you can kind of set up expectations a little clearer. It's a thin man who wants to put on weight, and then you have the rug pull of it not being the right fat that you were expecting. It maybe is a little bit more cleaner necessarily of a joke than the would-be scrapbooker, the good thing, right? Actually, speaking of which, let's talk about that briefly. What does that mean, the good thing? The good thing. In the 1890s, the phrase would have been used to refer to a bad bet or someone making a bad bet, usually on horses. The sort of thing where, I thought I had a good thing there, but I got unlucky, it didn't pay out. And it is unlucky, there is an element of that, but it's also sort of like with an understanding you probably should have known better, like maybe you shouldn't put the bet in the first place. So that's kind of where this comes from. Now, not every version of the joke actually uses this phrase. Sometimes the editors would go out of their way to change it, to localize it. So you might say that it's someone from a neighboring city or from another country or maybe just the other side of town or maybe a vague person you could get away with punching up at, a city merchant, right? Not something that's going to be taken too seriously. It's a joke after all. So if you could, awesome, but not everybody does that. Many of the jokes just continue to run, even like 1908, 19, 19 teens. There's a couple examples. They just use the good thing, and that kind of still remains the same. But here, the reason I want to mention this is like the butt of the joke is very clearly aimed at this guy. That's where the humor comes from, right? The good thing, or whoever it was, he failed to read the papers closely enough, and so this happens. There's also an interesting sort of acknowledgement here of the inherent frustration that people had with newspapers at this point, and advertising specifically, because this is an era fraught with a lot of dubious advertising claims and scams like this. And this is pretty mundane. You lost a dollar, and it's, they did technically tell you, and you just didn't catch it. But like this sort of stuff was happening. And one of the interesting things is later versions of this joke kind of go out of their way to make it clear that this isn't somebody who's reading a local paper. It's not the paper you're reading. This is one from New York. This is one from out of town. Just so that, you can kind of give some distance there. But I think they are kind of, acknowledging in that too. I think this is also interesting to kind of examine this, though, because the fact that this joke is used over and over by newspaper editors all over the world, in fact, I think illustrates this connection between scrapbooking and this newspaper industry. After all, the punchline, paste them in a scrapbook, that's about the guy. It's not about the idea of scrapbooking, right? The idea of scrapbooking is not. Just like it's a statement of fact that you could buy fat at the butcher's, the idea of pasting like a gas bill into your scrapbook, that wasn't something chosen to be random as a bit of funniness. No, it's a statement of fact. People were literally doing this, and they were being encouraged to do it, pasting things into a scrapbook of all sorts, not just gas bills, by newspapers and magazines, right? Now, of course, newspapers would tell you that the best thing to put into a scrapbook, the most valuable things, would come out of, well, the newspaper, right? So here's an example from the 1880s. Every citizen of this place should cut out and preserve for his future reference the several ordinances as they are passed and published in this paper from time to time. They embody a large part of our local government, and every citizen should be well posted as to their true import and meaning. Cut them out and paste them into a scrapbook kept for that purpose. So, yeah, all sorts of stuff. And it doesn't just have to be, city ordinances or election results, which they would argue would, keep track of that. It could be stuff that's even designed specifically to be scrapbooked, or even just run-of-the-mill articles that you might find in the going on of the community, especially if it has a connection to you. It all makes great scrapbooking materials. And you can kind of read into this sort of a financial reason here that they might like this. You don't want to make sure that your subscriptions aren't lapsed, so you don't miss out on some of this great scrapbooking material. Make sure you buy our paper, because that's where the good stuff is, right? But I also think that there's an interesting undercurrent here of how scrapbooks kind of validate the work that was done by newspaper editors and writers. They spent all of this time making, arranging, and writing all of these columns. It's probably nice and validating. It's a good feeling to know that there were people out there who found your writing interesting or valuable or notable enough to cut out and paste for safekeeping, to share, to revisit, especially as most newspapers during this period are readily discarded because, hey, there's another one coming tomorrow, right? So the newspaper folks had a strong connection to scrapbooking, not just necessarily because it incentivized their readers to pay attention, right? But also, pay to get the paper every day. They also, though, argued, championed the idea of scrapbooking as sort of this cultural shift that was happening in the late 1800s into the new century, that extended beyond newspaper clippings to, in their own publications, to all sorts of other things as well. And this does include putting financial information in there for safekeeping. After all, scrapbooks were considered, one of the best ways to keep little bits and bobs of all, sorts. It's a convenient way to organize them and put them into a book that you can share with other people, and or just to have to consult in the future. And so, yeah, they're not above telling people to keep bills. This is from the Wausau Pilot in 1907. It is well to keep every bill, paid or not, for an indefinite period. One never knows when mistakes may occur or when dishonesty may be attempted. The steel bill files are all very well, though they are not remarkable for their neatness or order. But a better way is to use a large scrapbook and paste the bills in alphabetical order, according to the names of those by whom they are preferred therein. If possible, it would be well to prepare the leaves like those of an address book, so that it would be easy to find any bill at any time. Of course, this is only a cheaper homemade substitute for a regular letter file, which is the very best thing for the purpose. So you can read into that like, yeah, there may be better ways to do this, but it's completely acceptable and it's a good option. It's effective, it's cheap to use a scrapbook as a way to keep track of all of the things, whether those are scraps of financial information or sentimental things of sentimental value, information, right, from the newspaper or a program or something you want to keep track of. These are all pretty good. So when they say paste them in a scrapbook in the joke, like, what does that actually mean? Because I think we might have an idea of what a scrapbook is today, but the reality is that it's changed quite a bit over the years. So the scrapbook, as you might examine it or recognize it today, goes back to the early 1800s. This is a period in which there's a lot of stuff being created in the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly you have cheap newspapers and affordable magazines and books and what we call ephemera. Things that are not necessarily intended to be a treasured keepsake or mass-produced stuff that's not meant to be kept necessarily. But all of these things provide a lot of things that not only would you want to keep track of, all of them, this ephemeral material, but also it's a thing that allows for a sort of expression. Right, you can tell a story by taking a pair of shears and a paste bottle. You can create your own book by pasting these different sources and making something of your own. And there's a lot of interest there, right? Now, of course, the way that they were making scrapbooks in the 1800s would be a little different than the way it ends up developing over the last 2 centuries. I think they would probably be surprised to see where we go. A good example of this would be photographs, right? Back in those days, there was not that many photographs in scrapbooks because, they're daguerreotypes and cabinet cards. They're not necessarily the easiest thing to paste into a book. But in the 20th century, with the the Brownie camera for Kodak and the development of a whole industry dedicated to making amateur photography possible, suddenly by the teens, 20s, 30s, cheap and accessible photographic prints are available, and they're not bad. And so they do start to put them in scrapbooks in large numbers, to the point where sometimes it before long is blurring the line between what is a scrapbook and what is a photo album. On the other hand, I think going back, people from the 1800s would be, the things that they were scrapbooking, maybe not so commonly used today, right? It goes both ways. For example, how many modern scrapbookers today would be posting their gas bills as a regular thing, as suggested, back in the day by the Cincinnati Enquirer? What has going into a scrapbook the way it looks, even some of the reasons why you might make a scrapbook, have all evolved and changed with the times. But I think the one thing that unifies all of this is the creation of a scrapbook, is a format that allows for a very, it's a flexible, it's a useful and remarkably effective way to tell a story. And I think that there's something universal about that. But this is also sort of a means of introducing something. So I'm going to go to that here. Yeah, as you might expect, we have a lot of scrapbooks. It probably won't surprise you to know that we have like hundreds of them in our collection in the archives. And as an archivist, I kind of struggle with this because scrapbooks are one of the most interesting and remarkable formats to tell a story with, right? Um, but we don't often get a chance to do that. As an archivist, it's also kind of a different relationship with scrapbooking than maybe you might have, because scrapbooks that we have they're not in the best condition. They are amazing, but they are also one of the most challenging and awkward physical formats to try to preserve for posterity. Newspapers and other ephemeral things, they're not meant, that's right there in the name, they're meant to just kind of be here and they're not here forever. Newspaper print, the paper is not going to, it's fragile. It degrades. It's not meant to stick around. And the stuff that they would use, the pins, the paste, the tape to adhere these things to the pages, with time the adhesive degrades and things kind of fall apart, and that all makes it very difficult. And so when it comes to scrapbooks, the way that we typically use them outside of like our own research occasionally, you know, I can't just take a scrapbook and put it in an exhibit and invite people to flip through it. It's just not going to be feasible as a condition thing. So what we typically do is, it might use a scrapbook to find information and, scan a picture or a program or something that's in the book and then reproduce it, which is a way of getting at it. But it never really, the difficulty here is that scrapbooks are their own cohesive artifact themselves. They are an object that was created by someone for a purpose, and just taking bits and pieces, you don't really get a sense of that. And so I thought, how do we do this? And then it occurred to me, we have a video series here. We have an audience that might be interested in tuning in and using this. So what I'm planning on doing is to take a couple examples from our scrapbook. I think I've got about four or so right now, kind of on lined up. There will probably be more as we go, if it works as a format. But the idea would be we'd take these. I'll set up a camera. We can flip through it together and see what they look like. Explore who created it and why, and all of the other things associated. I think it's a nice jumping off point to understand, the different ways that scrapbooks have been used, and also to tell some interesting stories to feature these on their own right. So that's the plan. As I said, I've got about four lined up. It's going to be a busy summer, but I'm hoping to get them out in the near future. So can look forward to that. It'll be published where you're watching this, in the same platform right here. In the meantime, feel free. Got the comments if you want to leave a comment telling me about what is your relationship with scrapbooking? Are you a scrapbooker yourself? Have you inherited scrapbooks from family? All of that. As we get into exploring some examples from our collections. But for now, I think that's probably that's it. So I'm going to say thanks for watching. Yeah, we'll see you next time for some more history chats.